Hi guys. Today will be our last new lesson about completing the square. I want to focus today's examples on when you get an imaginary answer, because we haven't done an example of that yet. But there is one other type that we haven't really talked about, and that's when you get a double root. You get the same answer twice. So just really quickly, before we do our imaginary examples, I want to talk to you about what it looks like when you're doing completing the square and you get a double root answer. So basically what will happen is after you've done your factoring and you get your like parentheses squared, it's going to equal 0. So if you're doing completing the square and you get a parentheses squared equals 0, that problem will have a double root because you're going to like square root the 0. It's the same reason why like the quadratic formula, you would get a double root if it was a 0 under the radical. So it's the same concept as that. So this is what double roots look like for completing the square. But let's focus on our imaginary answers because I want to make sure that you guys are able to do your imaginary problems and don't write no solution, right? That's not acceptable anymore. Now that we know about imaginary answers, we have to write an imaginary answer. Here's our first example for today. In this example, it is already set up for completing the square. My constant is already on the other side of the equal sign. So I don't need to move anything around to start this problem. Basically, I'm ready right now to put in my blank spaces, one on each side of the equation. Next, we'll need to figure out what goes in the blank space. So the process is the square root of the first number times 2 times the square root of the third number, which I don't know, equals the middle number, ignoring the sign. X times 2 times 2 is 4x, and 2 squared is 4. So 4 is what I will be putting into that blank space. We can use this information to now write the factored version of the left side of the equation. So x minus 2 squared is the factored version. And then don't forget that whatever number you put on the blank spot on the left side, you have to put the same number in the blank spot on the right side. So make sure that you have that number 4 over here. And when I add these two numbers together, negative 8 plus 4, I get negative 4. Now, this is where we start realizing that our answer is going to be imaginary. So if it's equal to a negative number, because our next step is to square root each side, when you square root a negative, that's when you start getting an imaginary answer. So on the left side, the square root and the square will completely cancel out, leaving us with the x minus 2. And on the right side, don't forget to put your plus or minus sign. The negative sign will turn into the letter I. And I know the square root of 4. The square root of 4 is 2. All right. So again, I've simplified my radical. It changes into a 2i. There's no more square root symbol because I was able to take the square root. And I put a plus or minus sign in front of it. The last thing we're going to do, since we want to get the x by itself, is we're going to add this 2. Now, just like yesterday, when we add the number to the other side, we're going to slide it in front of the plus or minus sign. We are not going to combine it with the numbers after the plus or minus sign. It needs to look similar to what our quadratic formula looks like, where it goes number plus or minus other stuff. Okay, so we're going to put the 2 in front of the plus or minus sign. And then because there's a letter I right here, we actually can't do anything else with this problem. We're done. So if there's ever a letter I after the plus or minus sign, you just stop and you don't do anything else. Same thing if that was still a radical. So if it was like 2 rad 5 and you can't do anything else, just stop and say, that's it. That's my answer. So my final answer for this problem is 2 plus or minus 2i. Now in this problem, my radical completely simplified, but I'd like to try one where the radical simplifies a little bit, but not all the way. So we'll do one more example, and that'll conclude our notes on completing the square. In this problem, it is not set up for completing the square. It is set up for like factoring or a quadratic formula, but that's not what we're doing today. So I'll need to move the 89 to the other side by subtracting it. And then in its place where it was, I'm going to put in a plus blank space. Next, I'll need to find out what goes in the blank space. So I'm going to square root the x squared. I'm going to times it by 2. I'm going to square root the blank space, which I don't know what that is. And it should equal the middle term. In this problem, x times 2 times 1 is 2x. And 1 squared is 1. So I'm going to put a 1 in the blank spot. And I'm now ready to factor that left-hand side. So when I factor the left-hand side, I'm going to get x plus 1 squared. It is the 1 from down here, not the 1 from the blank space. So make sure you're using the 1 from the bottom line. Next, we have to remember that whatever we added on the left side, we have to add on the right side also. So I will be putting a plus 1 at the end of the problem. By the way, I didn't mention this yesterday, but I noticed some students were struggling with this a little bit. When you're putting the numbers in the blank spot, it's always going to be adding because we're squaring a number. And when you square a number, you'll always get a positive answer. So the blank spots will always be added. You're never going to subtract, and you also should not fill them in with a negative number. So always fill them in with a positive number. All right. So negative 89 plus 1 is negative 88. And here again, I have a negative number after the equal sign. So I am going to expect to get an I, an imaginary answer. My next step is going to be to square root both sides. And just like on the previous problem, my square and my square root will cancel, leaving me with an x plus 1. And when I square root a negative, I'm going to get an I as part of my answer. Now, I don't know the square root of 88, so for right now, I'm just going to let the negative sign come out and become a letter I. And I'm going to put that plus or minus sign in the problem, right? So remember to have plus or minus. Now, 88 is a composite number, which means I can factor tree it and see if I can get any pairs of numbers. So off to the side, right, we should be factor treeing our 88. And again, I like to always just divide by 2 because it makes a nice long list of the number 2, which I can then very easily find my pairs. All right, so the square root of 88 looks like it's going to get a 2 on the outside. And we talked about this during class. You're going to put that in front of the letter I, but after the plus or minus sign. And then I have an extra 2 and 11 that are not paired up. And so I'm going to multiply those back together and put a 22 on the inside. Okay, so here's my simplified radical. 2 and I are outside the radical, and then 22 is inside. Remember, the second 2 from the circling, the paired, is just like gone. Now, just like on our last problem, since there's an I and there's also a radical in this answer, I'm going to move my 1 over, and then I'm going to be done. So I'm going to minus 1, and I'm not going to actually like minus the 1 with the 2 or anything like that. Those can't do it. So I'm just going to stick it right here in front of the plus or minus sign, and I'm going to call it a day. That's my answer. And it's not a pretty answer, but it is the correct answer. So this concludes our notes about completing the square, our final type of solving quadratic equations.